Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. Tammy Isaac, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you. The grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Welcome to season 4 of the podcast. I am happy to be back. Happy New Year. This season is for those who are still carrying what last season of life left behind. For those who showed up even when it was hard, for those who are learning that healing is not about rushing forward, but about staying present with what is real. Season 4 is not about pretending things are better than they are. It is about honesty. It is about breath and breathing. It's about giving yourself permission to move forward without leaving parts of yourself behind. So here in this season, we will talk about grief as it truly is: complex, ongoing, intertwined with hope, memory, identity, and change. We will name what often goes unspoken and create space for reflection without pressure to perform healing. So, if you are listening while navigating loss, transition, uncertainty, or quiet exhaustion, I want you to know that you belong here. This is your space to breathe, to listen, to take the next step at your very own pace. So welcome to season 4 of the Permission to Breathe podcast. I want to begin this season by acknowledging something simple and honest. Many of us did not arrive at this new year feeling refreshed, energized, or excited. Some of us arrived tired. Some arrived carrying memories that feel heavy, and some arrived with a quiet ache we do not always have words for. And if that is you, you are in the right place. So this episode is not about resolutions. It is not about fixing anything. It's not about rushing, healing, or pretending that a new year automatically makes things better. This episode is about reflection. It's about honesty, and it's about giving yourself permission to breathe as you stand between what has been and what is still unfolding. As the year closed and another one opened, grief often speaks louder at those moments, not because something new happened, but because endings remind us of what has already been lost. And sometimes the hardest part is realizing how much we carried quietly. So before we go any further, I want to invite you to just settle. If you can take one slow breath in and let it out very gently, and know that there is nothing you need to do while listening. There is no emotional outcome you are required to reach. You are allowed to simply be here as we talk about closing the year, opening the next: grief, hope, and expectation. Thank you for being here with me. Let's get started. As the year comes to a close, many people begin to reflect, even if they did not intend to. It's just something that naturally happens. Reflection tends to arrive quietly, and it shows up when routines tend to slow down, when calendars thin out, and when the noise of like your daily responsibility begins to soften just enough for your memory to start to speak. And for those who are grieving, this season of reflection can feel extremely heavy. You know, grief often arises at the end of a year, not because something new happened, but because endings have a way of reminding us of what has already been lost, what has happened, the experience, right? The closing of a year creates contrast. It places side by side what we hoped for and what actually unfolded. And then we start to remember who is no longer here. We remember the conversations that never came. We remember the plans that shifted without warning. We even remember the version of ourselves that existed before this life change. And sometimes grief shows up as sadness, but it also shows up as fatigue and irritability, restlessness, or even numbness. And sometimes grief shows up in ways we do not immediately recognize. It shows up in distractions, in our withdrawal, in the quiet urge just to isolate ourselves, in the feeling that sometimes is unfinished, even when we cannot name exactly what it is that we're experiencing or feeling. This is especially true at the end of a year when the world around us encourages this type of summary and closure, right? There is this pressure to label the year, to define it, to tie it up neatly with a bow or with language like growth, lessons, or new beginnings. But, you know, grief does not always cooperate with these tidy conclusions. You know, for many, the end of the year highlights what did not get resolved, the healing that did not complete itself, the answers that never came, the loss that still feels close even if time has passed. And I just want to say very plainly and clearly, there is nothing wrong with you if grief feels closer right now. Grief tends to resurface when we pause. And the end of a year forces pause, whether we want it or not. And when the pace slows, when obligations ease, when distractions start to thin out, grief often takes the opportunity to speak up and speak up loudly, not because you are going backwards, but because you finally have space to feel what you have been carrying, right? Grief is not only about death, but it is also about loss in all of its forms, right? It can be about relationships that change. I definitely had those this year. About health that shifted, about roles that ended, experienced several of those, and about dreams that didn't survive. You know, it can be about the person you were before life required something very different of you. And sometimes the grief is not loud. Sometimes it's subtle. It looks like heaviness when you try to plan ahead, or resistance to celebration, or a quiet sense of distance from, you know, things that once actually brought you joy. And this kind of grief can be very confusing, especially when others assume the new year should bring, you know, a type of excitement, when people expect energy or optimism and forward motion. But grief does not run on expectation. It only runs on honesty. The end of a year asks us to notice what has changed. And noticing change often brings grief with it. If you find yourself reflecting more than usual, feeling more emotional than expected, or questioning how you even made it through this year, that does not mean something is wrong. It means that you're responding honestly to what you have lived and experienced. And grief at the end of the year is not weakness, it's common, it's awareness, it's you paying attention to what has actually happened in your life. It is the heart recognizing the weight of time, the cost of survival, the truth of what was actually endured throughout your year. And here is something important to remember. Grief does not mean the year was meaningless. It means, or it meant that it mattered. What you experienced mattered. It had importance in your life enough to bring you this grief. And if grief is present at this year closing for you, it's not asking you to actually fix anything. It's asking you just to acknowledge. You don't have to analyze it. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to rush past it. You are allowed to say, even quietly if that is, this year held more than I expected. And that recognition alone is an act of care as you move forward in the year. Let's talk about grief as a keeper of time. Grief keeps time differently than in our actual calendar, right? So a calendar tells us what day it is. Grief tells us where we are. It does not measure time in months or years, but it measures it in moments, in before and after, in the space between what once felt familiar and what now feels changed. So for many people, life becomes divided by a single moment, like a phone call, a diagnosis, a goodbye that came too soon, or a realization that nothing would return actually back to the same way it was before. Grief marks that moment and quietly begins to rearrange how time is experienced. You may notice this when certain dates start to approach, like anniversaries and birthdays, holidays, or even just ordinary days that now carry memory that once didn't before. Time does not feel evenly spaced anymore. Some days feel long and heavy, and other days pass quickly, but they leave you disoriented. Grief, I believe, bends time, right? There are moments when it feels as if the loss has just happened, and even if years have passed, it still feels that way. And there are moments when distance is felt not because the grief is gone, but because life has continued in new ways. And this can be very confusing. You may wonder why something from the past still feels present, why a memory still has the power to stop you in your tracks, why your body responds before your mind does. And it's because grief remembers what the calendar tends to forget. It holds the emotional truth of what actually happened, even when time keeps moving forward. It doesn't forget. And this does not mean that you're stuck. And some people might think that, right? It just means that you're human. Grief also measures time by survival. It remembers the first days when getting out of bed felt impossible, the early weeks when concentration was hard, the seasons when you were simply doing your best to function. And as time passes, grief notices the small shifts, the moments when breathing becomes easier, when laughter begins to return unexpectedly, and when you realize you have learned how to carry the loss, even if you did not choose it. This is not forgetting. This is adaptation, right? You're adapting to this new world that has come. And grief does not ask you to move on, it asks you to move with it, right? That's the blessed thing I think about grief that most people get misconstrued, is that you grieve and you move on, but you move forward with every experience that you had before. And those memories and experiences are actually the things that help push you forward and to create your new environment. Now, for many, the year itself becomes a type of marker, right? You may think in terms of the first year, the second year, or the past year, not because time heals everything, but because time changes how grief is actually held. And as the year closes, grief often will bring awareness of distance that has been traveled, right? You may realize how much has changed since the loss, how much you have learned, or even how much you've endured. And even if the pain is still present, the way you carry it may be different. And this is important to acknowledge, because surviving the year, hey, that counts, right? Even if you feel disappointed in yourself, or even if you think you should be further along, or even if you compare yourself to others and feel behind, grief does not move according to comparison. It moves according to capacity. And your capacity this year may have been stretched in ways that nobody else saw or have experienced either. There were decisions you made in silence, right? Boundaries you had to establish, right? Moments when you chose to rest over explanation. Grief marks all of this, right? It remembers the nights you stayed awake, just thinking, the days you pushed through when you wanted to stop, and the internal work that never showed up on the outside. And here is something I want you to hear clearly. If you are still standing at the end of this year, that matters, right? If you're still standing and we've crossed over into 2026, know that matters, not because standing means you are finished grieving, but because it means you lived through something that required strength, even when you did not feel strong enough to make it through. Grief as a keeper of time, it's not trying to trap you in the past. It is reminding you of how far you have come. It is saying, this mattered, this changed you, and you're still here. So as you reflect on this year, 2025 that we've come out of, instead of asking how much time has passed, I want you to consider asking how much you actually carried. Not to judge yourself, not to criticize your progress, not to honor the truth of what this year held. Because grief is not only about loss, it's about love. And love leaves an important or an imprint on time. That imprint is not something to erase. It's something to carry with care. Let's talk about giving yourself permission to acknowledge the year. So, as mentioned before, as the year comes to a close, there's often an unexpected expectation to begin to summarize it, right? To label it, to decide whether it was good or bad, productive or disappointing, meaningful or even wasted. But grief does not fit neatly into summaries. So when you have lived through loss, change, or ongoing uncertainties, a year cannot always be captured by a single word. It holds layers because grief is complex, right? Contradictions and moments that sit side by side without resolution. You may feel grateful for surviving and also exhausted by what survival required of you. You may feel proud of yourself and still feel grief for what you had to let go of, and you may feel relief that the year is ending and fear about what comes next. I will say for me, of course, all of this can be true at the same time. But I'll say for me, this 2025 was I believe, a successful year. I had a lot of things that I accomplished that I wanted to, and then some things that I didn't know I wanted or needed to really happen. So I think I had an extraordinary year, but as come to the end of the year, when my calendar slowed down, when it was time to take a break, and took 2 weeks off from work, of course, this summarizing of the year that starts to happen, even though I, quote unquote, survived a year, right? And had a great year. I was very exhausted, more so than I had ever been. And so I felt a bit disappointed in myself that I didn't do a lot of things that I thought that I would do at the end of the year. Taking off, I usually take off the end of the year and do a few things, but I literally, I think they call it couch rotting. I kind of did that. I did, go see family, but I also, for the most part, did a lot of resting. And in that, I was, of course, allowing my nervous system to balance itself out from all the things that I've done. But also, I felt the grief of all of the accomplishments that I had, but not having my mom here to share in those accomplishments, because my mom was a very proud woman of her children and of the accomplishments that they had. And she would always brag on her children and always share all of the wonderful things that we would do and accomplish. And I started to grieve the fact that she was not here to relish in all of the things that I was doing that I know brought her so much joy. And also, too, if I'm honest, there's no one who relishes more in your accomplishments like your mother. And, I have friends that are proud of me and do their best to celebrate me. And while that's important and very helpful for me, I still miss the joy and the excitement and the relishment that my mom would have. And so grief, it doesn't fit neatly into these types of summaries, right? Because if you sit back and go, oh, well, Dr. Isaac, you had a really great year. And I'm like, yeah. And you would think that I would be joyful in this. And while I am, but I also have the grief. And so it's important to know that all of this can be true at the same time. Joy and sorrow can be held at the same time. Now, back to what I'm talking about is giving yourself permission to acknowledge the year. This means releasing the pressure to make sense of all of it right now, right? It means allowing the year to be what it was, exactly what it was, without forcing a particular meaning or a closure actually before you're ready, before you've come to this resolve. Now, many people carry guilt at the end of the year, guilt for not doing more, guilt for not healing faster, guilt for not being present or productive as they once were. But grief changes your capacity. That's one thing I've definitely learned as a high functioning person and one who's able to do a lot in a short amount of time and be very accomplished. But when that grief set in at the end of the year, it slowed me down and it showed the lack of capacity that I had in that moment to do anything in addition. So, what you were able to do this year may look different than what you were able to do in previous years. Like your energy may have been redirected toward surviving and processing and adjusting. And, just know that that's not failure. That's just reality. There were days when showing up might have taken everything you had, right? Days when rest was not a luxury, but a necessity, and days when your body and spirit were asking for care and not achievement. Isn't that something? Like, I feel like that is so true. I feel like I experienced all of that at the end of this year when my days slowed down, that it was not about achievement at that moment, but it was about my body, my mind, my spirit was asking for rest and care. And know that all of that counts, right? Nothing we felt this year was wasted, right? Not the tears you cried in private, not the confusion that left you like questioning yourself, not the moments when you felt disconnected or even unsure. Every feeling was information, right? Every pause was communication from your body and spirit asking for attention and not judgment. Acknowledging the year does not mean romanticizing what hurt. It means telling the truth about what it cost you. It means saying this was hard, but also without minimizing it. It means recognizing that some lessons came through pain and not by choice. And it means honoring the fact that you continued even when you didn't feel ready to continue. And you are allowed to name what the year took from you. Please know that. Maybe it took a sense of certainty from you. Maybe it took trust. Maybe it took a relationship, a role, or a version of yourself that you actually love. I want you to know that naming that loss is naming the loss is not dwelling, right? It's witnessing, it's acknowledging. And you are also allowed to acknowledge what the year gave you, even if it arrived quietly, right? It may have given you clear boundaries. It may have given you a deeper awareness. It may have taught you what truly matters. And even if that lesson came at a cost, you were taught something. And acknowledging the year means holding both realities without forcing balance. I love that. Okay? I love that. I love that. Acknowledging the year means holding both realities without forcing balance. I love that. You know why? Because we get so stuck in trying to force a particular balance, right? They talk about having work-life balance as if there's this 50-50. There's not. Sometimes in holding the realities of both your pain and joy, sometimes there might be a little more pain than there is joy, and sometimes there's more joy than there is pain. So don't force the balance, just allow it to happen. And before moving forward, I want you to know it's okay to pause and say, that was a lot. Let's talk about having hope without pressure. So when we talk about hope, especially in the context of grief, it is often misunderstood. Hope is frequently presented as something we are supposed to feel, something we should arrive at once enough time has passed, but hope does not work that way. Hope is not a requirement. It is not a test of healing, and it's not something you have to manufacture in order to be doing grief correctly. For many people who are grieving, the word hope can feel very heavy and far. It can feel like pressure, like an expectation to feel better, to look forward, to be optimistic before the heart is actually even ready. But hope does not demand enthusiasm. It does not demand certainty, and it doesn't demand that grief disappear. Hope, when it is honest, usually arrives quietly. It shows up in small, almost unnoticed ways, in the breath that you just took without thinking about it, in the decision to get out of bed, in the moment you choose to keep going, even when you did not know how to. Hope is not the absence of pain, it's the presence of endurance. Sometimes hope looks like allowing yourself to feel rest without guilt. Sometimes it looks like saying no when you need to. And sometimes it looks like acknowledging that today is actually heavy and choosing not to fight that truth, right? The kind of this kind of hope is grounding, right? It does not rush you toward the future. It meets you exactly where you are. For those who are grieving, hope often arrives alongside grief, not after it, right? They coexist, they share space, and that is allowed, okay? You can miss what was and still be open to what may come. You can feel sadness and still experience moments of peace. And you can grieve deeply and still notice flickers of light. Hope does not erase grief. It simply reminds us that life continues to unfold even in the presence of loss. Healing, when it comes, rarely arrives all at once. It comes in small shifts, in moments when the weight feels slightly lighter, in moments when you realize you handle something you once thought you could not. Hope can be as simple as recognizing that you survived something difficult, that you adapted, that you learned how to carry what you did not choose. And there may be days when hope feels distant, days when it feels out of reach or irrelevant. On those days, I want you to know it's okay not to search for it. I'm going to say that again. On those days, it's okay not to search for it. Hope is patient. It does not disappear because you are tired, does not leave because you are struggling, and it does not demand that you perform strength. Sometimes hope simply looks like staying present, like allowing yourself to feel what you feel without judgment, like trusting that you do not need to have everything figured out right now. You don't have to feel hopeful to be moving forward. That's important to know. Forward movement can look like rest. It can look like reflection. It can look like choosing honesty over avoidance. Hope does not push. It waits. It's patient. It waits for you to be ready. And when it arrives, it often comes quietly without announcement. So, if hope feels small right now, let it be small. If it feels fragile, let it be fragile. It does not need to be strong to be real, right? Hope without pressure is not about looking ahead with certainty. It's about trusting that you can take the next breath and the next one after that. And sometimes that is more than enough. Let's talk about setting expectations that honor our grief as we move into this new year. There is often the pressure to set new goals, choose a word, define a vision, or decide who you're going to be next as the new year begins. The language around January is always full of urgency somehow, and about moving forward, starting fresh, and leaving the past behind. But grief does not respond well to urgency. Grief asks for honesty. It asks for patience, and it asks for expectations that reflect reality and not performance. Setting expectations that honor grief means releasing the idea that the calendar determines readiness. A new year does not mean you should feel different. It does not mean you should be healed. And it definitely does not mean that what you are carrying suddenly weighs less. January does not erase December, right? It doesn't erase all of the months before. What you experienced last year does not disappear because the date changed. And that does not mean you're stuck. It means that you're human, right? Instead of resolutions, consider expectations that will allow room for your process. Expectations that acknowledge that some days will feel lighter and some will feel heavy. Expectations that leave space for rest, reflection, and adjustment. And you need expectations that do not require you to explain yourself. Honoring grief means recognizing that you can move forward without leaving parts of yourself behind. You do not have to choose between remembering and living. You do not have to choose between honoring the past and opening to the future. You can definitely hold both. And this is where expectation becomes gentler than resolution. Expectation does not demand change, it allows it. Expectation does not rush growth, it supports it. And expectation does not judge where you are, it meets you there. As you step into this year, I invite you to hold this truth with care. I'm going to say it slowly, okay? I can hold on to what I loved, honor, and what I lost, and still make room for what is ahead. Okay? Say it again. I can hold on to what I loved, honor what I lost, and still make room for what is ahead. Know that this is not a goal to achieve. It is a posture to carry. This is not a goal to achieve. It is a posture to carry, okay? It means allowing grief to have a seat at the table without letting it decide everything, right? It means acknowledging loss without letting it define your entire future. It means trusting that you can plan gently, that you can hope carefully, that you can move forward honestly. So setting expectations that honor grief also means letting go of comparison. Your timeline doesn't need to match anyone else's. Your healing does not need to look impressive, and your progress does not need to be visible to be valid. Some expectations may be simple, and that may be to take care of your body, to rest when needed, to speak kindly to yourself, or to ask for support when you need it. Some expectations may involve boundaries, saying no when something feels like too much, allowing yourself to change plans, and choosing peace over obligation. These are not small things, but these are acts of care for yourself, right? Honoring grief does not mean you stop dreaming. It means you dream with awareness, with flexibility, with compassion for yourself, right? There may be moments this year when grief resurfaces unexpectedly. And that does not mean you are failing your expectations. It means your expectations are honest, right? Grief does not disappear on a schedule, but it can coexist with intention. So as you move forward, allow your expectations to be steady rather than strict, right? Allow them to support you rather than measure you, because you're allowed to enter this year slowly. Remember that. You're allowed to adjust as you go, and you are allowed to change your mind. Expectations that honor grief create space for both memory and movement. And in that space, healing continues, one honest step at a time. Endings have a way of slowing us down long enough to notice what we carried. Grief often rises in that slowing, not as a problem to solve, but as a response to all that was lived, lost, and adjusted along the way. Today, we talked about how grief shows up at the edges of time, how it marks life in, before, and after, measuring distance not by dates, but by moments that reshaped us. We named that making it through this year in whatever way we did matters. We talked about giving yourself permission to acknowledge the year honestly, without pressure to summarize it neatly, without guilt for not doing more, and recognizing that grief change its capacity, and that rest, reflection, and survival were not shortcomings, but walks alongside it. As you move forward, you do not have to carry all this perfectly. You only have to move honestly. Grief may remain part of your story, and so may hope. You are moving forward one breath at a time, and that's enough. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. If today's episode met you where you are, I hope you carry that steadiness with you as you move through the rest of your day. Remember, you do not have to rush what you are feeling, and you do not have to have it all figured out. You can also read the blog that coincides with this episode every Wednesday at drtammyisaac.com, where I continue the conversation and offer space for reflection in a different way. If this podcast has been helpful, please feel free to share it with someone who may need permission to breathe too. Until next time, take care of yourself, one breath at a time. I'm Dr. Tammy Isaac.